Сайн байцгаана уу хүн төзөгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгээр олон улсын хуулийн зохицуулалтын зөвлөх ноён ЧАРЛЬЗ Монтин оролцож байна.
ЧАРЛЬЗ Монтин олон улсын хуулийн зохицуулалтын зөвлөх. ЧАРЛЬЗ Монтин Франц улсын үндэсний удирдлагын сургуулийг төрийн захиргааны удирдлагын менежмент, Парисын улс төр судлалын институтыг хуулийн эдийн засагч мэргэжлэр тус төгсжээ. Тэрээр эрх зүйн орчны шинжилгээний чиглэлээр 10 гаруй жилийн туршлага хуримтлуулсан бөгөөд үндэсний болон олон улсын түвшинд амжилттай ажиллаж байсан туршлагатай зөвлөх шинжээч юм. ЧАРЛЬЗ Монтин Франц улсын ерөнхий сайдын албаны илүү зохицуулалтын албаны дарга, сангийн яам, Шинэ Зеландийн Веллингтон дахь Францын элчин сайдын яамд улс төр хариуцсан консулын албан тушаалыг тус гашиж өгчээ.
Good afternoon, sir.
How do you do?
Doing good, and I was at your presentation at Chamber of Commerce the other day. Please tell us, what is your mission this time to Mongolia?
Well, I was invited by the National Chamber of Commerce and Industry to drum up some support and to give some knowledge, share some international knowledge about best practices in the area of good regulation and how the government can improve the stock of texts which apply mainly to business.
Mm-hmm. Best practices in regulation?
In regulation, and with a particular emphasis on the preparation of good new legislation through a process which is called regulatory impact assessment. It is a bit technical, but people understand when you explain what is the purpose, and the purpose is to make sure that the country provides a good environment for developing the national business and becoming more competitive, to export more, to provide more goods and services to the population.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's quite a wide range. In particular, every country has many hundreds of laws, and what was appealing for me was somehow to review your current existing laws and to make a particular good or better, cheaper for businesses, right? What is the best practices in that regard? What country is leading, etc.?
Yes, since the origin of societies, there has been a problem with legislation. There's been too much legislation. And so what we have discovered in the last 20 years is that you needed to do some housekeeping. Mm-hmm. And you needed to review, that is the word, review your stock of legislation. Mm-hmm. And you needed to make sure that you were not adding too much, and that is called checking the flow, making sure new legislation is better than the old one. Mm-hmm. And so the leading countries are the countries of the OECD, and they share the knowledge. And they have a few friends like Russia, who stays very close to the expertise developed at OECD, and also has partnership with all the other great countries like China, Brazil, not Mexico is a member, sorry, in the other big economic powers. They also liaise to develop together the best techniques, which are then localized in the local constitutional contexts of each country, and also the administrative traditions. You have to respect all that environment to acclimatize the new tools.
What was the best country in OECD?
The best country, it's difficult for me to say it like that publicly, because it's not my role to give laurels to. But you could say that the UK with Germany, France, the Netherlands, this group of leaders are feeding the discussion, which goes on collectively, and each one learns from the other.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about this technique, how to make assessment. Obviously, every country has own specifics, own stock of legislations, as you said. So what does that mean, this assessment?
So we can look at both the assessment of stock and the assessment of flow. What we were discussing yesterday was the flow of new legislation, especially as new legislation is often introducing fundamental reforms which are aimed at the business sector. And so, of course, this is a good way to start improving, modernizing. And so we call it the regulatory impact assessment, or RIA, is this technique where you list and then measure the potential impacts of the draft text or the draft policy, meaning the intention of the government to carry out a reform. You try and list the impacts, and the second thing you do is you engage a process of consultation with the stakeholders. And we hadn't mentioned it up to now, but this is a fundamental dimension of the new way of doing legislation, is to involve the stakeholders. They are the groups of people in the economy and civil society who have something to lose or to gain by the reform. And so they are in a unique place to contribute knowledge about the existing situation. And of course they are very keen to make known their views about what needs to be changed. So stakeholder consultation is a very important moment in that process.
And so we'll list the potential impact, also consult with the stakeholders, then after.
These are the two main activities.
Before
then you produce,
adopting any laws.
It's when the government has decided that they want to review a policy and to produce a reform. That is when you engage that process.
Who is, I mean, there is one group who is preparing that draft.
In the ministry.
In the ministries or from the government, those who has a right to, in Mongolia, for example, parliament members and then government, okay, the institutions of the government, which makes draft and which goes through the cabinet to the legislators. So obviously they have been doing their homework, and is there kind of independent expert who comes to this pool somehow?
So the expert is there more to teach the technique. Afterwards, the government and the stakeholders, they use that technique in the way which is most suitable to their objectives. But in many countries, this process of analysis and consultation is not conducted and always done very superficially. And this is where we come in support of a more professional way of doing things, which has the advantage of inspiring confidence in the work of the government and of international investors who say, oh, in this country they do good legislation because there is a real process to look at the consequences, the impacts, and to involve the stakeholders, including themselves, the investors. They have a moment where they can say, this law looks to be very heavy, lots of procedures, and we would like it to be more simple. Things, objectives like that of the stakeholders are perfectly legitimate.
Have you been somehow working anyhow with Russia?
Myself?
Yes.
Well, I was invited as the only expert, a bit like in Mongolia, to a conference of the CIS back in 2015. Yes, I worked with them. I was also in OECD. Well, I was a delegate to OECD. I was on the panel which was reviewing the performance of Russia in the area of regulation and impact assessment at the time when Russia was getting much closer and wanted to become a member of OECD.
And it is a member now?
No.
Well, Russia is not member?
It was suspended when some events happened.
The well-known events, okay. Speaking about OECD, is any country can apply, or what is...
Well, OECD, I can speak a little bit about that because I was on the panel that reviewed the membership of Colombia. And so what we do, it's just a bit, it's like what happens with the European Union. A candidate must adopt the acquis, it's a French word, which means all the legislation and the advantages which the members have accrued from being members. The new candidate needs to be capable of assuming the obligations before they can get the benefits.
I see.
And so that's what we do. In each area of competence of OECD, we send a team and we review the situation in the country. Like for regulatory reform, we would check if there is RIA. That would be a really absolute necessity. And we would see if the stock of legislation was correctly managed. And what that is called? It is called a regulatory review of the country. And that is one element in the assessment of the capacity of this candidate to become a member.
So there is a particular prerequisite.
Yes, lots of prerequisites.
Yeah, and no, just in practical terms, I thought being an OECD member makes legislation, regulations, many things in a particular country easier.
It's a very wide-ranging organisation, and its motto is better policies for better lives. So it tries to encompass all the areas of government activity which have a bearing on the prosperity and the happiness of the people. And so there are many committees where the delegates from each country come and meet the others, and they issue recommendations.
Okay, let's go back to our RIA assessment, right? Let's talk about, say, what kind of name is existing, maybe practices, which is very practical for a country like Mongolia. But please tell us about how does UK works in that system.
Yes, the point of the RIA, that's the way we call it between experts, is to get a picture as soon as possible in the policy making process of the likely impacts or consequences of a draft reform. And that means that in the office which is defining this new policy, they have to get to work very quickly on writing a document, which is also called a RIA. And that means that they have to collect evidence to support and even you would say they even start by trying to demonstrate that there is a need for reform. So they would collect like complaints of the people. And that can be done in a very scientific way with a website and disseminating.
The reason why that law is necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where it's not even the law, it's the policy that you need to change something in the country. Like you would take an example of road safety. Are you sensitized to the number of deaths on the road? And do you think that we should introduce new restrictions in the freedom of the car owners? You know, like should we decide that the cars can only be driven on alternate days? And according to what criteria, the pollution or something else. And that you must consult the citizens, because if you take a measure without informing them and asking for them to say what they think, then they're going to say all the time, oh, the government is always just limiting our freedom. So this is what happens. In the office where the policy is discussed, you first establish where there is a real need, an objective need. It's not an ideological need. It is looking at the situation, what the people think. Then you come to the conclusion, yes, Mr. Minister, we have to do something.
Okay, so this in England it's called also a paper RIA for any legislation. Then after that, this paper comes with the legislation. Or without, in which process it is used?
That is one of the points, is that you must not legislate if you can act otherwise to reach the same policy objective. one of the points, and you made it yourself at the conference, is that you must not multiply the number of new texts. So the second part of the RIA document is to list options. We have a problem, now we are looking for solutions. And we try and offer several solutions. Because there is a tendency in many countries to take the easy route out, which is to create a piece of legislation, which is a statement of intent. It is not guaranteed that the new text is going to reach the effects intended.
Legislation is the intention.
Exactly.
Okay. A very good point. When we talk about legislation, we talk about laws,
all types
which is approved by the parliament.
Yeah.
But there are also regulations,
Yes.
orders, decrees by the government, even sometimes by the parliament itself.
So this is also new in better regulation, is you are not sensitive to the level of the text. Anything that creates a duty or an obligation on the citizen, we call it a regulation. And it needs to be studied, measured, investigated, and if it is not, well, you are not producing good regulation.
So in the UK, how they call it?
Well, it depends on the constitutional setup. You have, of course, laws, acts, they're called acts. Before they are voted, they are called bills.
Yes.
And then,
in the US now it goes as bills.
Yes.
Okay.
Every country has its own terminology. And so we experts, we are trying to deal with realities. And the way you call them is not very relevant.
It's a secondary issue. So, in England, who is those people? Obviously a government office or doing some legislation, but then somebody is it independent writing a document as a RIA or a different?
Very good question. What you need is you need two types of actors. You need the people in the government offices who know the substance, the matter, to deal with that RIA, to fetch the figures and to launch the consultation, because they know what questions need to be asked. And you have a second type of actor who are the oversight people. The oversight people are those who say whether the work has been good enough. And those are the people who should be independent from government, if possible.
Okay, who can be there?
And normally you would have to have a panel of people, because if you have only civil servants, this is suspect. So you would normally associate civil servants and stakeholders, in this case mainly business people, or a few people from civil society, such as NGOs who are looking after consumer interests, or patients who represent the patients in the hospital. According to the subject, you would use a different.
That it will take very long process.
No, because that oversight body is permanent, and they have an agenda, and the government brings the RIA, and they take a look at it, and they give an opinion. Okay,
you said permanent, existing. The system is existing, but the experts can be different depending on the laws, right?
Exactly.
The machine is working.
Yeah.
So, the parliament, when they receive a draft, should they get a review of that panel? In which form, which format, and when?
Yes. So what Parliament have also the right to ask for good preparation of legislation which is presented to them for discussion. So in some cases, like even the European Parliament, they have a RIA service themselves, where they check that the document, the RIA document presented by the government, is sufficiently advanced or complete. They consider the opinion of the independent oversight body, and which in the case of the European Union is called a regulatory scrutiny board. The word scrutiny means that they are not writing, they are judging. And then the second optimal, it is not always done, is when a member of parliament offers a substantive or a substantial amendment, the RIA should be adapted to this new development, that the fundamental balance of the reform may be changed by the amendment. And so the most advanced parliaments at least recognize the need that the RIA should be adapted to the new text.
Because this RIA is so important for having, if I may say, for the quality of the legislation, so that it really meets the aim originally wanted to have. The question comes, for example, in Mongolia, there are some laws which, for example, mining law or VAT law in this country, or customs tax law exemption here and there, and they change, I don't know, total for last 15 years or so, some 300 total provisions were changed. That provision is here, and then they will add. So if there is any link between the amendments consequently happening after the law adopted and the quality of that amendments, depending on if RIA is there obviously will be less amendments of the law. You know what I mean, quantity and quality.
Yes, we have a technical answer to your technical question.
Okay.
Among the qualities of legislation which are recognized at the international level and certainly very influential with investors is the stability of legislation. So normally, right at the beginning of the process, I told you about the screening. Is there a problem? Should we do something? Well, you could say, if you are the expert in the Ministry of Economy, I'm sorry, you have modified that text 3 times in the last 3 years. You are going to confuse the investor. So please, let's put this on hold, wait 1 more year, review the situation with a little bit more data, and then we will decide whether there is a real reason for reform. So you see, and this is only the technical guy, because we respect the will of the people as expressed by their representatives, so we don't go against. We would say simply, could you please wait a bit so that we can do a better RIA? And that is already helpful. This is what my specialty, the people like me, the better regulators, we advise in the case of unstable legislation.
Let's talk about how many laws are enough for the country. And as you were saying before, from a first French Republic, you have been creating thousands of laws, which at the end confuse everybody. I mean, even as a computer will be confusing. So please.
So I've been thinking since last night, because you asked that question yesterday at the conference. And you remember I spoke about legislative inflation. And one measure I didn't quote for you, and I can now say, is that in some countries like the UK, but France also, have introduced this rule, and Australia I think, of 1 in, 1 out. Which means that if you want to propose legislation, you are the Minister of Transport, for instance, you have to find one that you are going to delete. Good. So there are policies in place which are part of better regulation policy that deal with the situation where there are too many laws. But your question was, how many is too much?
Yes. Okay, no.
So this would depend, this is why I've been thinking, so I have a better answer than yesterday, is on your capacity to deal with big numbers of legislations. Because with the new techniques to manage information, because we can also say that legislation is information. It is information with teeth.
Okay.
You can manage a lot. And the best example I have is the one of my own country, France, which is Légifrance, which manages online the content of all the legislation since 1961, but manages it not just saying, oh, there's a text there. No, it manages the legal consequences of each article and tracks which articles are still valid or have been modified by later articles. And of course, this is only administrative work. You need a judge. Only a judge is allowed, is empowered to make a decision on which legislation is still applicable. So you may have the short answer is you may have good information systems that allow you to manage a great number of laws. However, when you are lucky like Mongolia to have a smaller number of laws, you should try not to create the problem of legislative inflation by having a discipline, having RIAs to only legislate when it's really necessary, and try and keep the apparatus of each law as limited as possible. One issue we haven't discussed yet is the issue of multiplication of administrative procedures, which is also very harmful to the economy, and which is something which the government can work on directly.
So in RIA, also this administrative burden, because every law is to be administrated, and it is to be monitored, controlled, watched, went to the court, decided, and implementation of court decisions. All this administrative burden is always accounted, right?
So we are moving to another tool of better regulation, which is called the measurement and reduction of administrative burdens. This is a specific category of costs to the economy, which are due to the procedures imposed by government on the economic actors, such as companies that, for instance, it takes so long to get your permit to open a mine, for instance, and that is, of course, money lost to the company while they are waiting. So these, they are called technically information obligations. When you have to answer a request, when you are asking for a permit, you have to state your intention, you have to give your plan of funding, things like that. It takes time, and this can be measured under the principle time is money. And so what you can do for one law, you can do for the whole country. And many countries in Europe have engaged in a very heavy operation of measuring these burdens on the economy.
Where the audience can read about these works?
Everything is online in many sites. If you search on the keywords, if you don't want to be too confused, you could just go to the OECD website, and there you have an engine, a search engine, which would get you to the main documents. But it's still better to ask an expert to give you a bibliography.
Yeah, okay, all right. So obviously we cannot cover all these interesting topics for 30 minutes. Time is over, so I would like to thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge with Mongolians, which hopefully will have, as you said, better legislation for better life. So hopefully we are to that directions.
Thank you for receiving me.
Thank you, Mr. Montin. Thank you. За хүндэтгэгчдээ өнөөдөр энэ Хуулийн гишүүдийн ажлыг гаргасан хуулийнхын тоогоор биш, чанараар нь зэрэг тогтвортойгоор нь хэмжих чиглэлээр ийм сонин ярилцлагыг хийлээ. Энэ хүн бол яаж хууль журмыг ийм илүү амьдралд илүү сайхан амьдралын төлөө, сайн бизнесийн төлөө болгох вэ гэдэг талаар ажилласан ийм Францын алдартай мэрэгжилтнийг Монголын худалдаажуулалтын ахим урьж ирүүлсэн юм байна. За өнөөдөр манай ярилцлагаар ноён ЧАРЛЬЗ Английн Монтин оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.